I just don't have the energy right now to track down my phone and leave a really to deal with the fact that recording in 4K will take about an hour to upload and everything, especially since I'm thinking about heading off to the store in just a little bit. But I have a statement to make about things and the Visa versus Mastercard and um, just a statement, but and the Visa and Mastercard and Collective Shout and Steam and those guys. I've got something to say about all of it. I look the more that I look into Collective Shout as an organization, there's been two thoughts going on at the same time. One is that I very much so doubt somebody with the power of Visa and Mastercard really ultimately is truly terrified of this group of people. They're so powerful they don't need to worry. The second, at the end of the day, is that I find a lot of this very, very suspect, and I find the claim that Collective Shout is making of fighting video games to protect women to be very unconvincing, and I find them to be a rather fraudulent group of people that claim to support a lot of things, but the blind spots in their activities are so overwhelming and glaring that it leaves me in a state of where my head is spinning as far as the women's rights battle is concerned. The very kinds of policies that are being championed by Collective Shout, as it is a Christian group that is ultimately pro life, and I hate that term. Like, pro life, what? I mean, you don't vote against war when it comes. You don't do all the things. You don't require that politicians do, fund or create a way to fund all the things that are done that would be necessary to be done to, raise a child after it was born. It comes into this world and fuck it after it's come out of the woman's womb. The people raising it are on their own. It's all their responsibility. Fuck. Society doesn't owe them shit anymore. That's the view of a lot of these people, and still they call themselves pro-life, which is very bizarre. And Bush talks about creating a culture of life, and it's like, yeah, this country really doesn't have one. You have a, if you're preborn, they'll fight like the Dickens for you. The moment you come out of the wounds, you're on your own. Fuck you, sort of mentality, which fosters life. And I'm yeah, bullocks. And then what for what? So that we can be cannon fodder for the army. To go off to war and fight in this country's military adventurism all across the globe, where it tries to be all fuck yeah America, fuck it, and essentially impose American values on every country that doesn't truly share them, and police the world. It's and usually what that means is prevent them from doing anything that might threaten the some company that was that operates in the United States as bottom line and profits. That's what it's really about. That's supposedly been conflated into being the national interest in this country. But anyways, you know, moving on. These women, they have no problem calling themselves feminists by calling by championing the pro life label, which is not even a good one. It's not even accurate, but they call themselves that despite just being anti-abortionist. And this is an anti-abortion group who, the woman behind it, is peddling the same old nonsense that we've been hearing for a long time about, it's not even new. It's always, well, women might regret it. First of all, so what if they do? That's not a good enough reason to be against it. And second, actually, the tons and tons and tons of women have had abortions, and only a tiny fraction of them ever actually truly experience anything like remorse. So you're blowing that one and trying to blow that one up and make a mountain out of a molehill. And I think it's better ultimately if they feel guilty about it than they be saddled with the responsibility that they can't handle, and that they don't have the money to pay for. So when you call yourself a feminist and then you champion this anti-abortion nonsense, it leaves all of us with rational grounds to question your authenticity and if you're really one of us. The policies supported by collective shout are the very same, policies that are now, leading to women, not being able to get the health care they need when they're suffering an ectopic pregnancy, causing, ruptures in the fallopian tubes as the baby grows too big for the tube, and it's happening all over the place. And despite the fact that there are laws that supposedly carve out exemptions for these kinds of pregnancies on these anti-abortion states and everything, the simple truth of the matter is that that in practice, in reality, we're hearing tons of stories of women not able to get the health care they need because doctors are, in a state of being so afraid of losing their licenses and spending years and years and years in prison that they don't provide them services until they're, essentially on death's door, and the fetus has already ruptured the tube. I mean, this is a reality that's happening all over the country, and the reality of what it is to be a woman in, post Roe America at this point. And meanwhile, Collective Shout calls itself a feminist while championing, for Australia, the very same kinds of policies that have made these adverse outcomes for women in the United States, a reality and brought them to fruition. They are trying to change things, but they're trying to take it in a very anti-feminist direction. All things considered, and yet nobody seems to be. Maybe some people have called them on their shit, but I haven't seen it in the circuits that I travel in. I haven't seen it very much on Blue Sky. I haven't seen it very much on Facebook. I haven't seen it, very much on YouTube. I mean, I guess they're savvy. I haven't seen it, happening at a broad enough scale. And, Savvy doesn't, for the most part, attack the alleged authenticity of Collective Shout's feminism. That's not what our channel does and the message that it is, but mine will. I mean, I'm not convinced. How can you be pro-life and a feminist? It doesn't really make sense to me. It doesn't follow. And I think feminism should do a better job of policing the boundaries and make clear that women like this are not really one of us and can't sit with us. I know that feminism benefits from being a broadly inclusive tent that will try to include everyone it can, but there are just some people that are pushing shit that are so reprehensible and harmful to women and should know about it that they have no business associating themselves with feminists at all. And I think Collective Shout fits that category of people. And I think one of the things that really bothers me about it is that the vagueness of it, the lack of pushback from other prominent feminists, has created an atmosphere where a lot of gamers think that what they're being the enemy here is feminism, and the reality is more complicated than that. You have a group of pro-lifers who are calling themselves feminist without, very in a very unconvincing fashion, and have resulted, unfortunately, in a situation where games have been yanked from the store shelves, and everybody's worried that more like this is coming. But I just wanted to digress and state into the record I'm not particularly convinced of the alleged feminism of the Collective Shout or the women who associate with the group. I'm not. I mean, articles have been penned that saying that she's allegedly authentic. I still am not convinced. I'm skeptical. And I have every ground to be skeptical. They're pushing pro-life policies, and really anti-abortion policies, and yet it seems very rare that anybody calls them on their shit, moves to challenge the authenticity of their feminism, or does anything like that. It's just we've kowtowed over to it, and unfortunately now gamers think that feminism, scored some kind of victory against them. I'm I'm a little bit of both, feminist, gamer. I combine the two schools of thought into one, and the way that I feel about this one, at the end of the day, is that I wouldn't have done this. I wouldn't have tried to take gamers, games away, no matter how reprehensible I found some of these games. Especially now, because I'm having this thought, which is, would any of these games even have gotten any attention before feminist eyes, allegedly feminist eyes fell on them, before women went and dug them up and pointed at them? I don't think anybody would have been very interested in them until they became points of controversy and contention. It just would have petered out. Nobody would have really cared, that this kind of thing was happening. But now we've got all these eyeballs on it, and I think, and I feel at a very deep level like wool has been pulled over our eyes to a huge extent. Where people like this that are pushing for the very same kind of policies that have already come to states like Texas, where women are, suffered the very kinds of tragedies that I'm talking about, where their fallopian tubes ruptured and everything, and these kinds of adverse outcomes for women are being championed by groups like Collective Shout. They call themselves feminist, and I just look, gamers, don't believe them. They can call themselves whatever they want. That doesn't make them one of us. You know, refer back to look at Dr. Kat's video. The Manatee by Jim Gaffigan. You can call me the Manatee, just like you can call me a feminist. Yeah, right, forced birther. Inspired by Jim Gaffigan's rant.